Good morning and welcome to the gallery, to Queensland Art Gallery of Modern Art. My name is Sophia Sambono. I'm a Jingali woman from the Northern Territory, the Central Northern Desert and Elliott Newcastle Waters, and I'm the acting curator of Indigenous Australian art here at Quagoma. And I wanted to start by recognising the country that we're on today and that we're always on someone else's country, and to make sure that we respect and step lightly where we go and remember that as we move through country. Today we are here to hear from Danny Mellor and to see the new exhibition, Maru, the Unseen Visible. So Danny's multidisciplinary art practice, that's a big kind of word to say that you've worked in so many mediums. So drawing and painting and photography and sculpture and now moving image. And these mediums have varied greatly over the years, but across all of these works, he's consistently examined Australia's shared history, particularly through the lens of his Njonji, Mamu and Anglo-Celtic ancestry and his ongoing connection to the Atherton tablelands and rainforests of far north Queensland. And I'll let Danny explain more about his exhibition a bit, and we'll have a chat after his talk. But I'll pass over to Danny, who's going to take you through the talk.
Thank you, Sophia, for that introduction and also for the acknowledgement of country. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for making your way to the gallery this morning. What I'm going to do is talk today about some of the works in the exhibition and the exhibition generally, but what I'll also talk about are some of the ideas and research that I've been working with for a number of years now, and how they kind of drove, if you like, the way that I arrived at some of the work in the show, and also the reasons I make the imagery that I do. I'll start with the title of the exhibition. Maru, the Unseen Visible, is a way of talking about an invisible space or invisible worlds that become visible or clear to us. So that is the intangible becoming tangible or material. One of the ways and processes that I explore and research that in my work is to use the process of infrared photography. And infrared, as you know, is a spectrum that we as human beings we can't see. We register it, but we just don't see it. And so for the infrared spectrum, which is quite a wide spectrum, to use that in my work, I use the symbology of hidden narratives or hidden histories and things that perhaps aren't immediately visible. And through photography and image making, make those things visible as a way of talking about both our history, cosmological history, but also histories that may not have been told or are perhaps invisible up until this moment. So Maru is a word that talks about something or an object or a space gradually becoming visible. And that, in a sense, relates both to the materiality of the intangible, but also a conceptual space perhaps of understanding and knowledge building, where perhaps at one point we may not understand or know about certain things, but over time you become more aware of it. So it operates on a really broad range of contexts, that is, both the physical world or the material and that of the unseen or the invisible. What I'm going to do today also is show you some images that explain in some ways the reasons and how I work with what I do. So I'm starting here with a map of North Queensland region from Tully through to around Cairns. And it has a sort of a slightly mottled appearance. That's because I've knitted together probably around 200 photographs to actually create this aerial view. And it's an enormous expanse of coastline, landscape and rainforest. And the rainforest in this particular image shows as red. And the reason for that, it's infrared. Now, this is a kind of mapping, a colour infrared mapping that was undertaken by the Queensland government in the 1970s using a very particular kind of film that showed the forestation or vegetation, the chlorophyll, as a red colour. And so it allowed, I guess, in a mapping of environment and ecology, but it also allowed a mapping of almost like an invisible space. So I found it really fascinating that we use this in a scientific kind of way. You'll also know as well that many astronomical pictures from telescopes like Hubble or from the newly minted Webb are usually in infrared. And they're interpreted using colour and additions to actually see different kind of interstellar gases and certain things that are happening up in the cosmos. And on a sort of a more landscape level, I was really attracted to the idea of things that we couldn't perhaps see, and to begin developing a narrative or imagery that showed us perhaps there's more out there in a literal and philosophical, perhaps even a spiritual sense that we might immediately be aware of. So the importance of this particular area of map shows the places that I've visited or the areas that I've walked and driven to and spent time in over the last 20, 25 years. So I go back to this area almost every year, if not more, and spend time photographing, going on quite long walks and sort of visiting people and familiarising myself with that area of country from where my maternal family come. And one of the spaces that I have spent probably most amount of time besides around Tully is this area around Malanda and the edge of Wooroonuran National Park, which kind of arcs its way up here. And for those of you familiar with the geography of the Atherton Tablelands, you'll know that the Johnson River sort of begins to trace its way down towards Innes Vale. We move further over this range of mountains down here. You sort of go over the hills down to the Tully Gorge. So it's an intensely beautiful and spectacular landscape. And that beauty sort of hides a myriad of challenges and difficulties navigating it. But in many senses, the reward is that the images that come from that are really quite spectacular and really specific to place, if I can put it that way. So with the new moving image work, I created a sequence or series of images that I hope show a particular kind of journey through a metaphorical, but also a literal space of landscape. And what I wanted to do with that was introduce that idea of those hidden spaces, but also to show just the intense beauty, as I've put it, of the rainforest area, and how you then begin to map that in a conceptual way or a cultural way to talk about ideas around timelessness, that phrase past, present, future, to talk about how dreaming stories or an awareness of those dreaming legends might actually have a physical space that shows itself in the landscape and is connected to those oral histories. The title of the moving image or the film is called Dark Star Waterfall. And it's a slightly strange sounding title, but Dark Star was a very early way for astronomers to describe black holes. Black holes couldn't really be observed. They could be almost calculated. So there was no terminology to describe or name them. So the word dark star or phrase dark star was used, and it's very evocative. Like it conjures up these pictures of, sort of intense areas of interstellar creation of some sort. And so the analogy that's often used with black holes and the gravitational forces that are part of that astronomical phenomenon waterfalls are used as an analogy, and the passage of water over the edge of a cliff is used to talk about the event horizon, the point at which there is no escape from the gravity of a black hole. And so in the work, you'll see there are a few kinds of clips and sequences where you begin to then have a sense that, in fact, we're dealing with a really kind of interesting phenomena of gravity and space and timelessness. And so with works like this, they're infrared footage, they're a combination of some visible light footage, and so in many respects, it talks about the experience of being in that space and moving through it. With the work that I began to make in infrared, this is a piece going back 6 years now, when I began to experiment with different toning and how to actually convey a sense of not just majesty, but also mysteriousness about these places. And infrared will reproduce and replicate itself in a range of different colours, but I found that the blue in these early works reflected the works that I'd been making up to that point, which had a real focus on blue and its relationship to landscape here. And so with close-ups of that particular piece, I introduced the ghostly or spectral figures of people from that area, and the images were historical portraits that were photographed by the same photographer who took portraits of my own Aboriginal grandmothers for multiple generations in Cairns. And so there's very strong archival and personal connections that I have, not just with his work, but also those spaces that the people appear in. So what I find fascinating is the architecture of the landscape and rainforest, but also the way things can be combined that talk about everyday narratives and quotidian experience, if I can put it that way, but also, in a sense, they're kind of private conversations I have artistically with myself, and there are certain reasons that I might do this. For instance, this particular portrait of the child, and the man here with the Jahawan or basket is a portrait by Atkinson. And there are overlays of my own photography against other archival imagery. And I created that work for a show in London. And I knew that the work could be first shown in a gallery that was a few blocks or in proximity to the British Museum. And the British Museum is the space or collection which holds a copy of that photograph. And so there are these sort of invisible threads and conversations almost that I have with myself in making the work. It's almost like it's not a motivation, but it's kind of an indication of a private language and research that happens as part of the image making process. The pictures, if I can put that way, the images that I'm making with this show have a distinct sort of sepia toning, and that relates to archival imagery and that familiarity and the poignancy and the attachment that we have to old things, which is incredibly attractive. It's quite an emotional thing to look at an old photograph or an old image. It takes you back in a way that's very direct. So the experience of it is often quiet, it's sometimes poignant. And there's an interplay in my work as well, which is somewhat theoretical. It's a little didactic in that I might, with this one in particular, where I'm actually calling a painting. The title of it is the photograph. And so it's a play on what the object is, and art historically, how we interpret images and the way that we may read certain things. So we know it's a painting, but the title kind of implies perhaps the source, but also how we might recognise it as an image and compare it in our minds, because we have that capacity, understanding a broad visual language of how we might actually relate that to a photograph. Other works like these sort of examine those histories of documentation and the way early anthropologists like Walter Roth in Queensland would take photographs of Aboriginal people who are dressed for ceremony. This warrior here, a rainforest with a rainforest shield. This is one of the pieces inside was taking place in Freshly Up. We have someone who did a magnificent job, Matt, who helped install that. Thank you for your great work over that week. And so we assembled what were 5 shelves, almost like an archival library of images. And these images are quite specifically both from sort of the Atherton Tablelands, but also the North Queensland region. And it speaks again of that idea of collecting ideas, of research, and scattered in amongst that are images of my own photographs. And so in a way, I'm placing myself as part of that historical process and ways of looking and beginning to develop and shape a story about place, about our relationship to that, and how it is that we might understand, context, region, what it is that's important to us. And there's no particular way of reading a work like that other than it will take you on what is a very sort of individual journey. In many respects, it's quite specific in that the work relates to the archive, it relates to the idea of a library, but it also allows people and audiences, yourselves, to develop a narrative and to run your eye over it in what is a sort of a unique way of experiencing that work. Okay, so we're ending there with that sort of introduction. So what I'm hoping with this exhibition, with the interlayering, with the combination of images, with that journey through both contemporary and historical imagery, is to then begin to understand just the archaeology and depth of richness that is part of history from that particular place. But also, pictures and images have a relationship that is not just local, it's global, and it's also national. So this brings to mind the analogy of the microcosm and the macrocosm, and that is almost like a quantum analogy. Perhaps scientifically, a really good symbol of that is the idea of the DNA, where one part or small part of that DNA can replicate and build to create the whole organism. In that sense, when we look at something closely, we are actually experiencing things that are part of a broader conversation. And that's the same with art too.
So we ended the slideshow on the remembering of self and shadow, and archival imagery has this, well, all imagery has, particularly that records the past, has a huge role in how we remember history and our understanding of history. Those visual records really shape what our memories end up being of those times. And archival imagery is so important for Aboriginal people when it's so rare to have our families recorded in that visual spectrum. And you spoke a little bit about how that has impacted your life and practice. Did you want to speak any more about that? Or?
Sure. In what I was referring to there were a number of portraits that were made and created by the photographer Alfred Atkinson, who had a studio in Cairns of Aboriginal grandmothers going back multiple generations, which is unusual to have that sort of succession of images over so many years from one studio of an Aboriginal family. And while that's particularly rare, interestingly, it's also the same on my father's side. So somehow, as a family, on both sides, we've ended up with images of, grandmas and uncles and aunts going back some way. So yes, artistically, it has been something which has had quite an impact, if you like, to be aware of that sense of connection, and not just to people, but also to place and where those images come from and how, in fact, they're related to images from that same period and other spaces. So the whole history, if I can put it that way, which is a fairly broad conversation, of archival or historic photographs is a fascinating one, and how we mediate our own sense of understanding of history through images is really important.
Yeah, because so many of those images that we'll see, if you haven't already been in, they can be quite theatrically staged, and there is always a composition or a choice made, even in an image that we might think is reflecting the truth. So that it isn't, in fact, there is always this decision that's made. And I guess that speaks to also where you're creating a dialogue between photography and painting, and that painting seems more of a construction, but so is photography.
Absolutely, and particularly so in my paintings, because they usually have more than one source. And so they're almost like a mise en scene. It's like a theatre of sorts. And the reason I do that is to explore relationship and how it is that we might read an image differently, and also how artistically it makes it interesting for me. But coming back to this really important element of composition, reframing, cropping, editing, making decisions about how to show things, and perhaps how to convey, well, in the sense of historical portraits that show Aboriginal people, the idea of what Aboriginal culture was and what Aboriginal people were. And that when you isolate it in that particular way, it's important to understand the dynamic of that. And because that's it's always part of knowledge building, but it usually is a reflection of the cultural lens through which those people are seen, or another culture is seen, and another people are seen. But when you begin to consider photography, actually, we do that on ourselves, on every level, particularly when we're so familiar visually with photographs and how they're staged and how people do that. It's quite a natural thing to do. Where it becomes an interesting discussion is because it's against the backdrop of colonisation and settlement, and a different kind of life that began to be, you could say, introduced in many different ways across Australia. And so the particular sort of disruption that happened on the landscape was something that was very important to be recorded. Coming back to that very important historical point, at the time northern Queensland began to be settled and opened up, and those spaces with the use of mining, agriculture, they were cleared. There were kind of a displacement of Aboriginal people, the removal of those people from traditional lands. Glass plate photography was able to be taken to the field, and so photographers could record history photographically for the first time as it was happening, which was very different from the southern states, in that when you see historical pictures of, say, Sydney or Melbourne, perhaps, they're engravings, they're sketchings, they're watercolour paintings, etc. But from the 1850s onwards, there's a treasure trove of photographic images that really give us a sense, or a different sense, of reality as it began to take shape. And so, and I've said before, I have no particular judgment around photography as a tool. And I think that archive of historical photographs, as loaded as they may be, and however much you can read into that, they're really important documents. And they're significant, and it's important, in spite of all the conversations around it, to be able to approach those images and those collections with a certain sense that we are looking at a record that we would not otherwise have had if those photographers hadn't gone there and taken those photographs. So when I'm researching and looking at things, I feel, as an artist, I feel incredibly grateful that I can just look at a screen or visit a building and go to a space, even this holds true for museums as well, to be able to look at things, an object or a glass plate or a photograph or something that would otherwise have been lost and never recorded. And so the record is a very important notion in my work too. And to be able to then bring multiple narratives, different kinds of ways of looking at things, is what I hope a way of presenting an experience where we are now as people, and almost consumers of visual culture and artists and curators and people who look at art, to then to see and begin to almost like digest things in a way that people haven't been able to before. It's an incredibly privileged position.
Absolutely. And I mean, this archival record is also important for the creation of your paintings as well. Using those archival imageries, as well as like new photography and other visual clues from country and the other records of history. So you recompose those images in these new works that offer new ways of remembering or visualising the past, but also visualising multi-dimensional time. So you're looking at something that represents both history and the present, and that collapse of time and experience of country and place into that single image and into that single plane, in a way that's represented almost like true to a photographic work from that time, with the, as you mentioned, sepia and replicating like the aging of photographs. Do you want to talk about those works that are created that way here?
Yeah, and that's a really important point as well. And in many ways, those dimensions of the invisible histories really are the method that I sort of used initially was the infrared photography, because that really did take you to that space of the unseen, but then to convey the passage of time in a very different kind of way. It was important to then consider moving image and how that then, as artistically, you could show much more clearly the sense of timelessness by the overlay and combination of different images. And so whereas the photographic still images that I make have multiple layers to them, to then introduce time and movement was a thing which expanded the ways that I began to work, both with the concept of, if you like, past, present, future, but also to then begin to relate that very specifically to ideas around quantum science and that collapse of time almost, and how it is that time is not linear, and how then, after talking with people back in the Atherton Tablelands about things like rainbow serpent legends, which in rainforest language is the Yamini, how to show that, and could that, I guess I'm proposing, could that then be connected to the reality of the black hole, of timelessness and those kinds of cosmic events that really have an overlay of mystery about them. And I think when the rainbow serpent is spoken about, perhaps there's a sense that, that's a legend from, Aboriginal culture and it's all mysterious. And actually, perhaps there are some scientific parallels that are actually incredibly mysterious as well. But in fact, there are different sorts of analogies that can be used and brought together. So in fact, there is a kind of almost like a cultural intersection of knowledge. And this is not a new thing. Astronomers have been working with Aboriginal knowledge holders about the constellations and legends attached to those stars. How it is then artistically do we convey that and bring other dimensions into it through the use of infrared, through the use of visible light filming as well, and to then talk about ideas of reflection. The film inside is actually a two projection piece. So there are at times points of mirror reflection of imagery. And so it talks very directly or hints at the idea of this world and another world that we're part of, but is all around us, perhaps unseen kind of thing. So the work and the exhibition has multiple layers within it and different kinds of contexts and complications, you could put it that way.
Yes, thank you. I worked in a film archive for many years, and I was, loved seeing those archival films layered into that work in ways that I haven't seen before. It's really amazing to see, and you will be able to see it very soon. They're going to switch on the sound again. And we've come to the end of our time. So join me in thanking Dani, and we can go over and see the work.